Hi everyone. One of the most famous figures from Dark Age Britain is of course the famous St. Patrick. Although he's most commonly associated with Ireland, he came from Britain. But what's interesting is that there's good evidence that there was actually a second, now mostly forgotten, Patrick, who was remembered as a saint. So in this video we're going to look at who he was and what the evidence is for his existence. So most medieval references to Patrick are of course about the famous St. Patrick of Ireland. However, there's one very interesting account in the life of Saint Brioc. So this is an account which comes from the 9th century, but it's about 6th century events. So in this record, there's a description of several religious figures, 3 religious companions who went together to be educated by Germanus. So these 3 figures are Brioc, the main character of the account, and Illtyd and Patrick. And they were sent to Germanus. Now, because of 2 reasons, this is commonly assumed to be an account set in the 5th century. So for one thing, there's the reference to Germanus. Now, he was a very famous, prominent religious figure in Britain in the 5th century. He wasn't actually from Britain, he was from France, or Gaul at that time. But he was sent to Britain on 2 different occasions to engage in some preaching campaigns there. And he died in 448. So if he was the Germanus of this record, then obviously it must be set prior to 448. So he's called Germanus of Auxerre. And so that's one of the 2 reasons why this account is normally assumed to be set in the 5th century. The second is obviously the fact that Patrick is mentioned. So Patrick was definitely a figure of the 5th century. There's some debate about when exactly he lived and when he died, whether he died in the 460s or the 490s. But in either case, he was definitely around in the 5th century. So the fact that we have a reference to Patrick and Germanus seems to confirm that this was in the 5th century. So at first glance, this seems to be just a simple case of being a reference to the famous St. Patrick of Ireland. However, the reality is actually more complicated than that. So for one thing, consider the fact that Illtyd is said to have been one of those 3 companions. You've got Illtyd, Brioc, and Patrick. So Illtyd appears for the first time in British records as the educator of Samson of Dol. So Samson of Dol was definitely around in the 6th century because he was one of the main figures involved in the defeat of the infamous Count Connamore of Brittany. So we know for sure that Samson was around in the 6th century. That's absolutely not open to question, and his hagiography, or in other words his religious biography, is one of the earliest records that we have about this period. It dates to potentially as early as the 7th century. So it's a very early record, and it clearly places Samson in the 6th century, and it says that he was educated by Illtyd. So it makes it extremely unlikely that Illtyd was sent to be educated by Germanus of Auxerre, who died in 448, and then Illtyd was still around to educate Samson, who was still around to be involved in these events in the middle of the 6th century, because the overthrow of Count Connamore occurred in 560. That's a very firm date, and we know that from a contemporary record, the writings of Gregory of Tours. So there's no doubt about when Samson was still alive, and there's no reason to believe that this happened right at the end of his career either. And to be clear, it's not a case of Illtyd being a really elderly educator of Samson as a child. The account in the life of St. Samson shows that their lives overlapped considerably. They were both adults at the same time, though obviously Illtyd was much older, but he wasn't a very, very old man when Samson was just a child. The account makes that clear. So it's not possible, really. It beggars belief to have Illtyd being educated by Germanus before the year 448, and yet still being around as a perfectly active contemporary of Samson, who was active in the overthrow of Count Connamore in 560. That's just not viable. There's also the fact that Brioc, independently, in the life of St. Brioc, he's made a contemporary of Childebert I of the Franks, who was king from 511 until 558. So again, that indicates that Brioc was around well into the 6th century. Another really crucial point, and this is very, very important, and it really should be noticed more often, is the fact that in this reference to these 3 companions being sent to Germanus to be educated, it specifically says that they were sent to Germanus in Paris. It doesn't mention the city of Auxerre, it mentions Paris. Now, in the 6th century, there was, in fact, a Germanus of Paris. He's normally known today as Germain of Paris, but that's just another form of the name Germanus. So in these medieval Latin records, he would have been Germanus. But if you want to look him up, he's Germain of Paris. Now, he became a priest in 530, and then later on he became a more prominent bishop. So really, this indicates that this account of Illtyd and Brioc and Patrick being sent to Germanus in Paris to be educated is surely about this much later Germanus and not the Germanus who died in 558. This would satisfy all the chronological considerations. However, it means that there would be a 6th century Patrick, a 6th century religious figure called Patrick, not the much more famous St. Patrick of Ireland who lived in the 5th century. But if he really existed, then could we find other records that mention him? Well, yes, it seems that we can. There's one record which is particularly notable in this context. It's not from Britain, it's from the continent. It dates to about the year 600, and I'd love to be able to tell you what it's called, but I cannot pronounce it. But you can see the name here on the screen. But the point is, this is a near contemporary record that seems to mention a 6th century Patrick. Now, based on this record, we know that there was a St. Patrick who was active on the continent, and based on this and I think other records as well, although it's very difficult to track them down, scholars generally agree that he lived in the 6th century. For example, consider this modern French source which tells us that this particular church in France, which has his name included in it, was dedicated to this St. Patrick who evangelized the region in the 6th century. And then there's this information on this website which says the church stands on the site of an ancient abbey founded in the 6th century by the monk Patricius or Saint Patrice, who evangelized the region between the Loire and Allier rivers. He is said to have been buried in 555 in the church he founded on the pagan site then known as Gentilico. So his existence is as good as confirmed from that document that I mentioned, which dates from about 600. But in that document, he's basically just a name in a list. It doesn't really give any information about him in terms of biographical information. So I'm not sure where this other information comes from, but I have found it in plenty of French sources. I don't know what the actual medieval line of transmission is for these claims, but in any case, it does seem to be accepted within French tradition that he was a 6th century figure. So that's the point. He was a 6th century St. Patrick active in France, which is exactly where the Patrick who accompanied Illtyd and Brioc was said to have gone to. It all ties in. Everything seems to indicate that the Patrick mentioned in this British record accompanying Illtyd and Brioc is the same as this 6th century Patrick from French tradition. But it gets even more interesting than that, because I believe that we can actually identify this Patrick with a specific individual mentioned in the medieval Welsh records, the Welsh and Latin records from Wales. So I think that he actually can be identified with a fairly prominent, well-known figure from these records, a figure who was active in the 6th century and is recorded as having a name very, very similar to Patrick. In fact, he even has his own entire hagiography. That's how well recorded he is. Now, in terms of figures with the name Patrick, there is, I believe, only one person who actually had the name Patrick recorded in Britain in the 6th century. But there's no real reason to believe that he was the Patrick that we're looking for. However, when we look to the south of Wales, because this Patrick who's recorded as having that exact name is from the north of Wales, but when we look in the south, we find something very interesting. Now, the reason why southeast Wales should be important is because the companions of Patrick in the life of St. Brioc were Brioc and Illtyd. Now, both of them were from South Wales. Illtyd was active particularly in the southeast. Brioc was also from South Wales generally. So the fact that these two figures came from South Wales and they were sent with Patrick to be educated by Germanus indicates that Patrick should also be a figure from the south of Wales. Otherwise, what's he doing with these two figures from South Wales being sent together to be educated on the continent. It makes sense to find him in South Wales, and when we look there, specifically in the southeast, we find this figure with this very similar name, Petroc. Now he's usually called Petroc, as in Pedrog, but his name is also recorded as Petroc because in the medieval Welsh records and Latin records, D and T were often exchanged, and so was C and G. So his name is often written in modern Welsh orthography as Pedrog, but his name is also recorded in the medieval records as Petroc, and so some modern sources call him Petroc as well. Now obviously there's a very close similarity between Patrick and Petroc. When we consider the fact that spelling wasn't standardized in the medieval era, and when we look at various records about different individuals, we see a wide range of spellings. So I think it's perfectly plausible that the name Patrick could have been corrupted into Petroc, or vice versa. I'm not sure which one is more plausible really, but both of them are certainly possible. But aside from the fact that the chronology matches, and the geography matches, and the name more or less matches, is there any other evidence that indicates that Petroc was in fact this mysterious forgotten second St. Patrick? Well, I believe there is. When we look at the life of St. Brioc, remember, because that's the record that mentions this Patrick, then we find that Brioc is said to have been sent abroad to study, to be educated. Then he returns to Britain and he travels to Cornwall, and he specifically goes to the region of Padstow. Now that's interesting because in the life of St. Petroc, we find something very similar. We find that he too is said to have been sent abroad to study, and then when he returned to Britain, he's said to have gone to Padstow in Cornwall. So we find this same sequence of events, or a very similar sequence of events, in both the life of St. Brioc, where Patrick is mentioned, and also in the life of St. Petroc. So that lends support to the conclusion that the life of St. Brioc, when it mentions Patrick accompanying Brioc, it's talking about Petroc, who's recorded independently as doing something very, very similar in his own hagiography. So that, I believe, indicates that they were the same person. In addition, in the life of St. Petroc, we find an account after he's returned to Britain. We find an account where he and his men meet a prince of that region, apparently still Cornwall, called Cynan, which is another form of the Welsh name Cynan. And the reason why this is so interesting is because we find a similar account in the life of St. Brioc. We find that Brioc and his men were said to have encountered a tyrant of that region called Cynan, and they converted him. So this is another reason to believe that the Patrick of the life of St. Brioc, who's said to have accompanied Illtyd and Brioc, was the same as the better attested St. Petroc. So, although there's no definitive smoking gun that proves this identification, I think it is very, very likely. So with that in mind, what do we know about Petroc? Well, he was the son of Glywys. Glywys was a prominent king of southeast Wales. He was the king after whom Glywysing was named. Glywysing was the kingdom of what's basically Glamorgan today. So he had quite a lot of sons, and one of them was Petroc. All the other sons became kings, but Petroc decided to pursue a life of religion instead. So he became a preacher, and if we conclude that he really was the Patrick mentioned in the life of St. Brioc, then it appears that he was sent to Paris to be educated by Germanus of Paris. And then he returned to Britain, and he spent most of the rest of his life preaching in Cornwall. So that's what we know about the mysterious, forgotten second St. Patrick of Dark Age Britain. Now let me leave you with this question. What happened to the Minoans after the Bronze Age? Did they just disappear? What happened to them? Well, if you'd like to know the answer, then come back next time for my next video.